Hey guys, it's Miko from ML Sound Lab, and this is 5 things that I've learned about amp modeling. Okay, this month we are actually celebrating 5 years of amped plugins here at ML Sound Lab. What that means is that we've had amped plugins out for more than 5 years now, and throughout the years I've definitely learned a lot. Today I want to talk about 5 different things that I think are worth discussing, and hopefully these help you understand amp simulation even better than before. Number 1. There are things that an amp sim plugin maker cannot fix. That all ties into things that happen before and after the actual plugin. So yes, we develop a plugin, but we cannot control what happens before your signal hits this plugin and what happens after it. Now, the main problem obviously that people have already been talking about is what kind of USB interface or audio interface you're using. Are you using a high Z guitar input? Are you using a DI box? Because all real tube amplifiers have a different kind of an input. Most of the time they will have a 1 mega ohm input, but that's not the case always. Depending on what kind of interface and DI box you're using, you might not actually be using a realistic input. What that actually means is that the way your interface loads your pickups is different, and that actually changes the sound quite a bit. So there will always be a small part of your signal chain that us amp sim developers cannot influence. So whatever you're using, it kind of sucks for us. Now, there has been a lot of talk about the realistic input volume and having that set correctly for your plugin. This does actually matter, but I would argue that you have so much range in the gain knob of the amplifier, and the difference between using that gain knob and the input volume is gonna be very, very minor. So I wouldn't overly emphasize trying to get it perfect, because ultimately you do have a gain knob on your amplifier that you should fine-tune to fit your guitar anyways. So I don't see that as being as big of a problem as people are potentially making it seem. I do, however, see a big problem if you're using some kind of a noisy input for your signal and getting problems in that sense. Number 2, impulse responses, IRs, are the most important thing in your guitar tone, even in amp sim plugins. Now, I do understand that when you are looking at a guitar amp plugin, most of the time you're actually seeing an amplifier that looks awesome, but in reality what you're hearing is a guy like me crouching over a 4x12 super loud, trying to get that microphone position to be perfect and sounding amazing. And that is where the tone comes from, not the amplifier and the knobs. Obviously that does matter, but let's just say that if I had to pick a bad amplifier and a good cabinet, or a good amplifier and a bad cabinet, I would 100% of the time choose the bad amplifier and the amazing guitar cabinet and being mic'd up perfectly. Obviously that is a big strength for ML Sound Lab. We started out making premium impulse responses. So if you didn't know, we made impulse responses for fractal audio. So even if you get an XFX3 right now, you will get more than 100 factory cabs made by me for that unit stock. Same goes for the Neural DSP Quad Cortex. When it was released, I actually made all of the impulse responses for that unit. Nowadays, I think it's more like 50% of the stock cabinets of a Quad Cortex are actually MLIRs. So now I actually realize me saying this is kind of saying that my tone is everywhere. Everywhere you look, it's going to be MLIRs. That is partly true, and I also actually did the impulse responses for the Neural DSP plugins all up until I think the Omega plugin. So yeah, I'm everywhere. Woo! Number 3 is the importance of understanding and knowing the amplifier that you are modeling. Now, this is something that I learned very quickly when I started making amp sims. When I'm modeling an amplifier that I'm not that familiar with, I don't personally even know where to start. And the strength with a smaller company like us is that I have my hands involved in every single process. But I know from experience that in some cases, for example, when making some software, it's not the CEO or the guy with the most knowledge who's actually doing the work. So let's say there is an amp sim plugin out there and the guy who did the modeling wasn't too familiar with the amplifier. For example, let's pick a difficult amp to model, something like a Mesa Boogie Mark IV or Mark II or something like that. It has certain things that you have to do to get that sound. For example, you need to have the preamp bass super low and the graphic EQ bass super high to get that low end back, and that gives you the sound that you want to get out of that amplifier. Now, if your plugin is not modeling this section of the amplifier too well, then what is the purpose of the plugin? That is kind of a thing. A similar thing comes to mind when thinking about a Marshall JCM 800. There are so many amazing modelers out there, but I don't personally feel like too many of them have a very truthful representation of a JCM 800, because that amplifier doesn't really sound right unless it's actually going through a 4x12 and the amplifier is cranked quite high. Load boxes and things like that don't always react quite the same way, even the good ones like the Sur here, which is what I usually recommend for people to get. It doesn't really behave like a 4x12 with all the amplifiers, especially Marshall ones or the Mesa ones. When I run my JCM 800s, I actually have 3 of them from the 80s. When I run those the correct volume, super loud, through a 4x12, they actually have way more gain than any of the models that you can find out there. It's more closer to a Friedman BE, like the normal BE channel, not the hairy BE. So that's an important thing to consider. The person who was responsible for modeling the amplifier, did they have the knowledge of how that amplifier works and how it should sound when making that amp model? And that brings me to number 4. Modeling something perfectly doesn't matter if what you're modeling is wrong. Kind of ties into what I just talked about. If you're, for example, using a reamp rig for modeling your amplifier, are you running signals correctly? Are you sending a realistic volume into the amplifier or realistic impedance with a really premium reamp box? Or are you doing the capture for real, which is what I'm doing nowadays, where I'm actually plugging my guitar directly into the amplifier and getting 100% realism out of the amplifiers. This is not something that I understood when I started out, definitely, but I do now. And also what I said about the load boxes, I've heard from the industry, and I know from working with some of these companies that quite many amp sim developers actually use load boxes for making their amp sims, something that kind of behaves very differently to a real 4x12 guitar cabinet. Now, you could argue that, yes, the amplifier itself is a realistic model of an amplifier, but if what you really want is to get the experience of what that amplifier sounds like when it's actually blasting a 4x12, then you're not actually getting the same thing in that model because of impedance once again. In a similar way, when I'm talking about guitar DI impedance going into your USB interface, there is an impedance between the amplifier and the cabinet or reamp box, and they are talking to each other with their impedance. And what I find is that with many amplifiers, especially Marshalls and Mesas, when I use them with reactive load boxes like the Sur, which is one of the best ones still out there, the low end is way off. So assuming that you are modeling a plugin perfectly, sounds just like what you are hearing, which is your tube amp going into a load box, it still doesn't matter because that is not what people want the amplifier to sound like. People want that amplifier to sound like it going to a real cabinet and what that actually sounds in the room. So for many reasons, I would say many models of amplifiers out there sound very woofy and muddy and fuzzy, while the real life amplifiers are, generally speaking, brighter than the amp models that are out there. Okay, number 5 is that plugin developers always have difficult decisions to make. For example, are we sacrificing workflow or are we choosing to have the most realistic thing out there? Are we gonna spend more time getting perfect impulse responses or presets or things of that sort? All the impedance stuff that I discussed today. All of these things are difficult decisions to make. There's no one correct way of making things. And for example, in my opinion, I don't think that if there's an amplifier that has 20 switches on it, I should model 20 switches on the plugin. Because ultimately, even I don't even like to use these real-life amplifiers that have so many switches. A good example is a Friedman B100 Deluxe that I have You probably can't see it, but it's up there. I love the sound of that amplifier. It's one of the best sounding amplifiers in my collection. I absolutely hate using it. I hate to have 6 switches behind on the back side that I don't even know what the switches are doing at that particular moment, then having 3 switches on the front panel. So if we're talking about, for example, our plugins, the flagship plugin, we did make the decision of including all those switches, but man, did I almost go the other way. Like, okay, I think Friedman probably should have decided on the best way to have those switches. They should have done that themselves. Maybe I should choose them, but I'm not the correct person to choose which way around those switches should be. So workflow is what I've personally tried to optimize. I think people, even professional people, will choose a plugin that is quick and easy and just works over something that is super complicated and fine-tuned. That is just something that I've learned to be true in many of these cases. Just think about all the classic plugins that are being used the most and how simple they are. How many times they are just like a one function plugin like Waves L1 or Waves L2. Like even the more complex analog plugins like Waves SSL, Comp, Bus Compressor, you don't really tweak it all that much. You just kind of touch 3 controls and that's it. And that's kind of something that I've learned, that I think if I'm gonna make a plugin that's gonna be timeless and iconic, even if you think about our plugin line, how amped roots, it doesn't have death knobs for many of the amplifiers. No one ever said anything about it. No one ever had a problem with it. Some of the amplifiers actually have a depth or resonance control. Not in the plugin, and no one had a problem with it. What is the best thing for the end user? And most likely the end user will not agree 100% with all your decisions, but you are the one who has to make them and live with them. Okay, and that is the 5 biggest things that I've learned from making amps and plugins for 5 years. Again, just a reminder, we are actually celebrating 5 years of amps plugins with a 50% off discount of all our amps and plugins, so go try them out for free. If you like them, now is one of the best times to get those plugins. And overall, I think I could have listed like 50 different things that I've learned, and obviously I learn something new every single time I start modeling an amplifier. If you have any questions about that, even geeky questions, just ask down below. I'll try my best to answer as much as I can. And any of the other questions you may have about the topics that I already discussed, also ask down below. I'd love to have a conversation about all these things. And I've been Mikko from Memo Sound Lab. See you later. Bye bye.